Hello, thank you for coming, for joining us today. Today we are joined by Heidi Boghosian, an attorney and co-host of the Law and Disorder radio program. She is executive director of the A.J. Must Institute and was formerly executive director of the National Lawyers Guild. She is the author of Spying on Democracy and the book we'll be discussing today, I Have Nothing to Hide, and 20 Other Myths About Surveillance and Privacy. So our plan is to give you an understanding of privacy and surveillance by talking about some of the myths from the book, and near the end, giving you some actions you can take. If we have time, we're going to touch on some current events related to privacy and surveillance. As was mentioned in the chat, if you have questions during the program, please put them in the chat and we'll talk about them as we go along. Just have it a little bit casual and can discuss things as we're going through. So the first myth that we're gonna talk about is myth number 4. That's the one we're starting with. That myth is we should worry about government, not corporate surveillance. So there's several aspects to that myth. Some of it involves corporations doing things in their own interest and some on the behalf of others. Heidi, would you explain more about that and debunk that myth?
I think most people by now are aware of the extent to which corporations, businesses gather our personal data. So anyone who's ever bought anything online knows what targeted ads are and the multi-billion-dollar business that data aggregation is. So much has been written about that. But I think when Edward Snowden back in 2013 came forward with revelations about NSA surveillance, what many people learned was how closely the government partners with corporate entities to share data, to monitor different groups, be it activists. For example, during Occupy Wall Street, an organization I used to work with did a lot of defense of activists. And we saw immediately how financial institutions worked with Homeland Security fusion centers to share intelligence about protests that were happening. And so pretty effectively across the country, we saw law enforcement shutting down a lot of those encampments for people who might remember what that was like. But corporations, of course, have a vested interest in protecting trade secrets from espionage, but they also, with community activism, oftentimes don't want messages that activists might be bringing in protests to hurt their bottom line. So corporations are very sophisticated in how they not only monitor critics, but gather our data and package it, resell it for huge profits. The problem is that the government can then request that data through warrants. And one of the things that I thought we could talk about in a little bit would be how that's already happening with the reversal of Roe v. Wade in states with strict anti-abortion laws. We've already seen requests to Google for data that shows individuals going within the parameters space-wise of, say, abortion providers. So corporations, we have, I think, a myth that Uncle Sam, we don't want to be monitored by the government, but they're work very closely and hire corporate contractors to do a lot of their surveillance work.
Yeah, so there's multiple aspects to it. Corporations do it in their own interest, and they work hand in hand with police or other government agencies to use that information to their own interests. So the next one we were gonna talk about was the title myth, which is number 2 in the book, and it's I have nothing to hide, so I have nothing to fear. This myth has implications for society overall and individuals as well. Um, can you tell us why this myth is incorrect, and why maybe we probably should have some fear, some trepidation?
Well, this also dovetails with the issue of corporate surveillance. And I think that um, before before we started this, I was looking at one of my favorite books. It's called Surveillance in the Stacks. It was written in 1991. You may have read it. It's about the FBI's library awareness program that was started in 1973, where the Bureau tried to enlist librarians to identify foreign agents who might access sensitive information in the stacks and who might pose a threat to national security. And I think the same dynamic, I mean, it's historic in this country, the tension between civil liberties and national security is really informs this myth of I have nothing to hide, so I have nothing to fear. And that is that we as Americans are told that to be a secure nation, we need to give up a little bit of our privacy, that if we're law-abiding citizens, we have nothing to worry about. And there are many problems with that. The first problem is that there is no real proof that the kind of entrenched surveillance state that we have right now, a very sophisticated mass apparatus of spying on us 24/7, no evidence that this has made us any safer, that it has thwarted any more threats than sort of the usual police investigation, law enforcement tactics that have been used for decades in this country have protected us. We know that mass surveillance makes us conform. And so the problem, obviously, with a surveillance state is that it really is the ultimate level of social control. And as a country that values personal freedoms and liberty and our Constitution, we have to make sure that we don't fall prey to the myth that to be safe, you need to give up some of those freedoms, because the Constitution does not go on a break for national security. And what happens is, after the attacks of September 11, 2001, of course, Americans were afraid of another terrorist attack. And the problem was that when we're afraid, we tend to believe the government when it says that it's necessary to spy on us. So I think one of the things we have to remember is that in this country, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. And people who have broken the law still have rights until they've been tried by a jury of their peers or a judge. And we shouldn't give up that notion of innocent until proven guilty just because we conform or we do what the government wants us to do, and therefore we are not seen as sort of dissenters or going against the grain of the status quo. I think that it's important that people acknowledge we all have something to hide, and there's nothing wrong with that. We value privacy, and to be autonomous individuals, we need to decide when we give up our privacy, be it medical information if we want to share with a friend or an employer. But once we say that our lives are an open book for the government to monitor us, then we really go against the grain of what makes the society as free and as cherished as it is.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that was in some of my notes that I had from reading the book, is that it's really important that we have, our privacy, so we retain that autonomy, so we, like you said, we have our freedom to like act as we would want to, rather than just like acting because we're worried about something.
And privacy is important to society as a whole. We have reasons that police have anonymous tip lines to call in information about a crime going on, or suicide prevention hotlines, or people with HIV, AIDS who want treatment but don't want to have their personal records shared, widely. I think that privacy, especially in the fields of mental health, um, abortion, again, for those few states that are going to allow that, it's an individual right that we need to decide when to share with others and at what point.
Right. It's phrased as, we should not worry about our privacy because it's going to benefit society as a whole, but it probably benefits people more to have that public health, to not, worry about their, own, like you say, mental health or own health stuff being exposed, especially in the case of, like, say, if you're trying to get a job and, your employer somehow like found out about something before you're trying to get a job, then that could have, negative effects.
Also, I noticed that in 2021 in St. Louis, 100,000 social security numbers of educators were exposed, and it cost $50 million to fix that. And apparently, from what I read, it was a flaw that had been known for more than a decade, but hadn't been discovered, which goes to show that we want to have faith that the government is safeguarding our data that they keep in databases. But there's, as everyone knows, so many enormous data breaches. That's traffic in New York City.
Yeah.
The data breaches that go on every day are just astonishing in number.
Yeah. So let's see here. That was sort of our introduction, our overview, and now we're gonna get a little bit more into some more details and look at myth number 3, which is number 3 is let's see here, encryption and anonymity tools. Those are for terrorists. So for this myth, you even use an example involving a library in New Hampshire. I believe it was the Kilton Library in New Hampshire. Maybe you could talk about that example, but and also why this myth is false, and why people might want to use those tools just on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, and the tools that we're talking about are anonymizers like the Tor browser, encryption, that I think more and more people are realizing is actually not just for terrorists. But the FBI for years had what they called a fear of going dark. And that meant that they were afraid if they needed to break into someone's computer, they needed what's called a back door to get in with a search warrant. And they, for many years, would say that anonymizer, Tor, things like that are the domain of terrorists. Again, it sort of feeds into, if you have nothing to hide, why would you want to use that? But we know that human rights advocates around the world sometimes need to protect the work that they do. Journalists, especially when there's a reporting on, for example, national security matters, maybe they have a confidential source. They need to protect that person's identity. So increasingly news outlets, the media, are using secure drop ways to communicate anonymously. So of course it's true that some individuals will use encryption or the dark web for nefarious purposes, unlawful purposes, but that percentage, I think, pales in comparison to the vital uses, be it for a free press or other reasons, where sometimes privacy is needed in communication.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just a lot of the tools are just things that people use on day to day to, protect their own information, and they're not trying to hide anything or trying to do anything nefarious. They're just trying to, you know, uh, safe keep their own information. And I mean, people personally want to safe keep their information, but I mean, businesses want to safe keep that information as well. So it's
Exactly. Trade secrets, all of that. Makes for a more secure internet too.
yeah, because I mean, if you don't have, trust that the information that you're sending over the internet is going to be safeguarded, then you might not trust that as a way to send it. So yeah. Yeah, I guess. Did you want to talk about that that library that had the
Yes,
what's it
Kilton Library.
the library, Hilton
Yeah,
Library?
Kilton Library is in New Hampshire. It's actually turns out to be not far from where I grew up many years ago. But I heard about it through Allison Macrina has it's the Library Freedom Project. I think they might have changed their name
Okay.
several years ago. You may know them, but she mentioned that a librarian at Kilton, Chuck McAndrew, had actually started, he was kind of new on the job. This was a few years ago. And he brought the Tor anonymizing browser to the computer terminals in the library. And I guess news of this made its way to the Boston Homeland Security Department somehow. I guess juicy gossip spreads quickly in New England. And a couple of agents from Homeland Security came to visit the library and said the very thing that I noted the FBI is known to say: why do you want anonymizing browsers in the library? Terrorists use them or criminals use them. You don't want them searching things in the library, illegal activity. So initially, the library stopped using the Tor browsers, and then there was a lot of public outcry in the community, protests, and they brought it back. And I personally think it's a fabulous effort. One of the reasons is, you might have a teenager who wants to look up some things but doesn't want, or not just a teenager, but anyone, but a teenager, for example, wanting to learn about sex education or something personal that maybe they can't do at home or they don't feel comfortable. Here they could do it in the library and there's no record and it's all private. And there may be other things, looking up cures for cancer for someone who's just been diagnosed. And again, you don't want people to be able to go in and see your browsing history. So I think this was a wonderful initiative. I would hope more libraries would do that. And yeah, they fell prey to the sort of government's fear rhetoric, and then they changed their mind, which was great.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, that is one of the things that libraries care about, safeguarding customers' privacy, the ability for somebody to come in and use a computer and trust that, whatever they search or whatever they create is not like, once they log out, that information is going to be gone, that it's not going to be, there for somebody else to get. So, I mean, there are customers who worry about, I come in, I use the library, to use the computer to get this work done or to, make this search. And I don't want that, information getting into somebody else's hands, especially the next another customer. So, we do have safeguards in place for that kind of stuff, but it's part of library's mission to be a trusted place, to be a place that people can count on.
And let me just follow up, because after the attacks of 9/11, I know that many libraries were visited by law enforcement wanting to know who signed out certain books. And I understand that some libraries, because they couldn't announce that, for example, the FBI had come in, they devised a clever way, and I'm forgetting the exact wording, but they would put up a sign saying, rats, I can't remember, something about that no one had come in. I forget the legality about it, but they were very clever in letting people know that it was a safe place to do their searches, to take out books. They weren't being monitored by law enforcement.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if that still happens. It probably does, but we don't hear about it as much.
Right. Yeah. If it does, yeah, we don't hear about it too often. Okay, so let's see here. Myth number 9 is what we're going to talk about, and that's our next myth up. Police don't monitor social media.
Yes, they do. Yeah. Sorry.
So I was going to say, sometimes this one could be considered technically true because of the way police departments go about monitoring or getting this information. But can you explain how that myth is wrong, and maybe give a picture of what the police do?
So that was a myth. I kind of made that myth up myself because I was running out of myths. I think that some people might have the perception that why would police, they might not even think about that police would look on social media, but they do. And I know in New York, for example, there's a public housing project up in the Bronx where police monitor the social media accounts of a lot of teenagers who live there. And they were looking for some drug dealing. But the problem was, as you know, when you have friends on social media, often we don't even know who these friends are. They may be a friend of a friend, but what happened was the police tracked about 100 young people, mostly, as I understand it, male Latino teenagers. And they did a mass arrest because they were looking for some, relatively minor drug activity. The problem was very few of the people that they arrested, the kids really, were involved in unlawful activity. They were just friends who had been communicating on social media. And to make matters worse in this case, the police charged them with very complicated, sophisticated RICO racketeering charges, which, I mean, that's usually a white collar crime. You need lawyers with really intricate knowledge of how to defend a RICO case. And these were kids that didn't have, for the most part, money for attorneys, or if they had attorneys, they were public defenders who didn't have that kind of experience. It was really a shameful case. But the problem, I think, in looking through social media is that adults and law enforcement especially are not in tune with the jargon and the way kids talk to each other, the shorthand, the rhetoric. They can misinterpret things. If English isn't a first language, that can also present problems for the people who are posting. So it's very easy to make a case if you're an agent to make something look nefarious. You can misinterpret words. You can, bolster your argument that there was a lot of drug dealing going on, for example, in this housing complex, and lives are ruined. The cost, both to community, families who were separated, the kids were locked up for months at a time. it was just, to me, a waste of everyone's resources all around, and didn't do what, effective law enforcement should do. It should follow good cues and, make a solid case for prosecution.
Yeah. In that chapter, and when you were talking about that, you were talking about how, sometimes it's not the police themselves who do it, or, directly they employ other outside companies who do it. And I think it was in that chapter where you talk about, like, because, or maybe it was in some of the other chapters that's somewhat related, where because it's an outside company who's doing it, they don't necessarily always follow the law or the rules that they should.
That's right. That's a very good point. And that goes back to the thing that we learned from Ed Snowden. When the government hires intelligence contractors, those private companies aren't bound by the US Constitution. So we can see things that go on, lack of accountability, shady, sometimes, shady operations. I'm not saying that's the norm, but their oversight is not as rigorous as we would hope, especially when it involves matters of national security and our safety and whatnot. But yeah, businesses are making a nice profit off things like, I think Geophysia was one of the companies that scours social media. And it's to their advantage to get a lot of hits or things that they pass on to law enforcement and say might be suspicious.
Yeah, that's section, chapter really struck me, because as you were talking about, some of the, it's, if you're trying to interpret social media text, it's, it's like any of us who are communicating through just written word, through a chat or something. Like there's things you don't get in just a written, part of it's, the lingo, the language, that they're using, but part of it's that you don't necessarily always get the emotion, get whether, like, maybe it's a joke or they're being sarcastic, or, it's just some kind of humorous thing. Yeah.
Yeah, the context is missing or can be misconstrued very easily.
Right. If somebody says something that's like, like something like, I'm going to kill that person, and you don't have the context, it could just be like, I'm really angry at that person, and like, not mean I'm actually going to kill that person.
Right. You don't want a SWAT team showing up at your house.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see here. Number 12 was what we were going to talk about next on our agenda. Number 12 is the Constitution protects reporters and their sources. And that one, I guess based on the Constitution and laws, is that myth true? And I guess, what does the Constitution and laws say, and versus also what happens in practice?
Well, so there are no, shield laws. There's no federal shield law to protect journalists and their sources. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and that basically means what we saw, especially during the George W. Bush and the Obama administration, was targeting a lot of journalists who reported on matters, especially national security, that presented the government or government programs in unfavorable lights. James Risen, formerly of the New York Times, was one Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who wrote a book on a program that George Bush, a botched program, and they subpoenaed, the government the Justice Department subpoenaed him several times, really tied him up for several years in court, ultimately dropping the charges, but they wanted him to reveal his source. And we saw that a lot also with Obama in several whistleblower cases where Obama, and we're seeing the same thing with Julian Assange, being charged with the Espionage Act for releasing documents, which for journalists it gives what we call the chilling effect. It sends a message that if you're going to report robustly on matters of public interest and you have a source who wishes to remain anonymous, you may be subject to the government trying to find out who your source is. And what we saw were several instances in which, for example, with James Risen and a couple of other journalists, their emails were monitored, their phone calls, the metadata was gathered. So that means not the content of what they said, but who they spoke with, how long they spoke with them, when, and you can discern a lot. There's a chapter I have on that. Metadata reveals a lot about your activities and your interactions, and they can glean really good information from that. So I think that a lot of people think that journalists are protected, when in fact, not only have they been subject to surveillance, some of it unlawful, secretive. And when I say unlawful, meaning there wasn't probable cause to open a real investigation based on facts that perhaps a law had been broken or the source had done something unlawful. So what happens is it makes reporters less willing to report on stories that may seem controversial or that they know the government will be upset by. And that, of course, has happened. We have less investigative reporting now with 5 or 6 major media conglomerates really running all of the media. And it obviously does a huge disservice to the public's right to know newsworthy information.
Yeah, if journalists, are afraid to, as you say, there's that chilling effect. If they're afraid to report on something, then if they're afraid of that, then stuff that the public might want to know that we might want to come to light, is going to either not come to light or take longer to, because, that as much as they might, have their principles and think that it's something that people should know, they also have to worry about, their own livelihood and their own personal lives. I guess, that one, I guess I forget what I was looking at. Is it the Second Amendment that talks about the abridging the press?
Fourth Amendment.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, First Amendment. Sorry, First Amendment.
First Amendment. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I mean, it just seems like while the First Amendment says that Congress shouldn't make any laws abridging a free press, it seems like that doesn't necessarily exclude police or in government agencies from, trying to suppress, journalists or, I guess, harass them and scare them.
I think journalists are really under fire right now. They've gotten a bad rap, especially by Donald Trump and many other presidents. We're seeing an uptick in violence against journalists who are out reporting in the field, attacks. And I think many view them as the enemy, which is really a detriment to all of us.
Yeah. So that was myth number 12 that we were talking about there. And so we were going to talk about a couple of the last couple myths in the book. myth number 20 is the penultimate myth. That one is surveillance can't predict future behavior. Part of that one relates to police trying to predict and prevent crime. How is that myth off base, and what do we need to know about the predictive power of data?
So this is an interesting myth, and I think people may be hearing a little more about this in the news vis-a-vis algorithms. Predictive policing is being used by a lot of police departments. Basically, they'll feed data, say from a high crime neighborhood or certain people who may have been repeat offenders. So, and this is where algorithms come in. They'll take this data, and what they'll do is they'll try to predict, for example, where a neighborhood might have another flurry of crime. The problem is, say you have a neighborhood where in New York, we had what is now an unlawful stop and frisk program where the police had to sort of make quota every day and make a number of arrests. And they'd go to maybe lower income neighborhoods, and they'd arrest a lot of young Black and Latino males disproportionately. So the same people might get stopped. Sometimes they'd be arrested for resisting arrest or speaking back. They found the program was prejudicial. It was horribly implemented, and it was ruled in a court of law that it was unlawful, so it was stopped. But for years, that data amassed, was collected, and for example, could be fed back into New York's predictive policing programs. And as they say, you get bad data in, you're going to get bad data out. So it reinforces the weaknesses in how law enforcement dealt with those particular communities over, say, a period of 20 years. And you got faulty data that would sort of recriminalize the same communities of people. And I think some of these, I think Los Angeles had a very expensive predictive policing program that I think was criticized. I know Chicago used it. So the problem is, and we're seeing more attention to this now, a number of projects are really looking at how to reduce bias in certain algorithms that are used for predictive. I mean, I'm using crime as an example. Obviously, there are other, applications. Yeah. So for example, if you're a bank and you have a model to predict who's going to be a good bet for giving a mortgage to, depending on the data that you input, it's going to taint the results if it's flawed data or if it had bias built into it. So I think this is something that a lot of companies are increasingly aware of and trying to iron out some of those fundamental flaws.
So currently, I guess we'd say that, they're not great at predicting, which is bad because, if they're predicting and they're wrong, then that can have negative consequences. But then on the other hand, that hasn't stopped them from pressing forward with trying to, predict things and prevent things beforehand, which, with human behavior, as complicated as that is, like, it seems like, do we really want that? Do we really think that that's, something that they can truly do?
You just reminded me of a related program, and it also ties into how companies, as we mentioned with the social media Geophysia, during the COVID pandemic, when a lot of schools had remote test taking and graduate level schools
Mhm.
They have this thing called eProctor is one of the companies. So what came into being were a lot of companies that would monitor students taking tests. And they would look at things like the number of times your eye twitched in a minute or your gaze averted, and they would try to predict who's cheating on the test. Now, obviously, aside from the fact that the students knew they were being monitored and it made them more nervous, it turns out that so many false positives came up. They have the same programs that, in light of all the school shootings that we've seen in the last 20 years, companies are now selling at very high rates to school districts programs that monitor if you have kids using laptops that are given to them by the school. These programs monitor, you may be familiar with this, I was shocked, but they'll monitor your keystrokes and they will send warnings if they think someone may be going to harm themselves or pose a risk, a safety risk to other students. And again, the problem is a number of problems, but one is the false flags were so many, and two, they had a human person, I guess, after the software picked out thousands of hits, a human would go through, but the humans were poorly trained. They made under $10 an hour. And the companies were making a huge profit, but it wasn't making anyone safer. And it was adding this whole other layer of complexity and bureaucracy. And I think that's a trend we have to be aware of, not only in predictive behavioral programs, but companies out to make a lot of profit, selling something that they say will make us safer or will make test taking more accurate. And I think, you know, people have to bring some common sense back into the equation.
Yeah, that's a great example. Let's see here. So, what myth number 20? That's sorry, 21. That's the last myth in the book. And that one is there's nothing I can do to stop surveillance. This one is a call to action. In that chapter, you provide several ways that people can change things or guard their own information. Some of it's, you know, a call to different people in different professions, but we go further into that myth, I guess, that people in different professions, what they might be able to do, and individuals, what they can do to change things or guard their information.
Well, yeah. First, I do think there's greater awareness, even in the last year, of how our data is being gathered, stored, you know, stored indefinitely. So I think certain states are doing a better job. California and Illinois are very good about data privacy laws. And I think there's something like 20 other states that are considering more robust legislation to protect, you know, to hold companies accountable for if they improperly store our data and they have breaches. There need to be regulations for that. At the same time, I think that all of us have to catch up with the high speed of technology. I mean, we're all addicted to our personal devices. That's happened in a relatively short period of time, but our lawmakers haven't kept up with really effective ways to hold the big tech companies accountable. Social media is out of control. So I think it's up to every individual to be more vigilant. And no one can do this perfectly. Systems are getting better. For example, a lot of people are using Signal to text with much more privacy. But there are a few basic things that I think everyone can do that aren't that difficult. One thing that I've done is for passwords, I now use phrases because a phrase is easy to remember. But do not use the same password on all your accounts, which apparently a lot of people do, and try to change them every so often. So that's basic. There's a term called no knowledge, and it means no knowledge is good knowledge. And that is, don't just keep the personal information that you gather, store, to really what you need. I think all of us have a glut of information. I mean, the government has a glut of information. We're swimming in information overload. I remember a few years ago, there was sort of a green movement, and you could read about, like, just don't bring paper into your house, you know, how to avoid accumulating things, just don't bring it into the house. And the same thing's true for electronic. Don't save as much. Use software, if possible, that's open source, meaning non-proprietary. So a company doesn't own it. That library at Kilton, New Hampshire uses open source. He made the switch to that as well. So Mozilla Foundation, Firefox, the DuckDuckGo search engine doesn't track you. And I recently went to their website and they've really expanded their services and great information on that. I mean, a lot of us are used to, I know I use Google by default, but when you start really thinking about how you're being tracked, I think some of us are saying, like, it's time to disconnect a bit in our lives sometimes. And I think small measures, even if you pick 2 or 3 things that you're going to do and you're going to do them consistently, that's a great start. And I always recommend that people go to the Electronic Frontier Foundation because they have a great website with tips on, you know, practicing better cyber hygiene, as we call it. I also say beware, don't download too many apps. And if you do, get them from a reputable source, clean your cookies, you know, delete your cookies. And also, we get banners for the most part now about cookies on websites. Don't just click it to make it go away. Actually read them and, you know, limit them. So be a little more proactive. And I think once you start, it becomes infectious, and talk about it with friends.
Yeah, all good.
Little bit helps.
Yep, all great suggestions. What do you think about advocating, like, you know, to our congressmen, our senators, for either like local laws within the state or federally?
Yes, definitely. You know, I think I looked up your state. I don't think has very good privacy laws. Change happens locally. Write to your elected officials. You know, find out, read the newspaper, see when there are breaches, get involved. It's, you know, we're all in this together. And I think one important thing to know is that the internet as a whole, if we have all these companies not safeguarding our data, the whole nation is more vulnerable to hacks. We're hacked every day. I mean, countless hacks. One entity that used to track them just stopped tracking because it's really a wild, wild west out there. But take care of your own data. Ask your legislators to be more proactive and start writing to companies and, you know, picking something and making it your project. We all have to play a part.
Yeah, it seems, you know, the situation, you know, is more like you don't have privacy, and it's a matter of, you know, between, you know, individuals and groups and you know, lawmakers, you know, reining things back in and pulling things back in, you know, over time, as we realize, you know, the lack of privacy and how much has been given away or taken away, whichever way you want to put it.
We don't want to be complicit in that. I mean, we
Yeah.
are to a certain degree, but I think we can all smarten up a bit. And it's fun to learn about it. I mean, every day in the paper, there's something interesting about privacy and data.
Yeah. So that was all the myths we were originally planning to cover. One hot topic that we were going to talk about, or current event that you were gonna go into a little bit deeper, was geotracking of women, as you mentioned earlier, in states after this after Roe versus Wade was overturned.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I actually well, we're all aware of how we're targeted with ads that tailor us individually. And especially if you're online, you start getting shoes popping up and things that you search for. Geo-targeting, geofencing is, think of it as a virtual perimeter around a certain space. So I happened to just be looking around online and I saw that, you can pay for ads, say on Facebook. If you want to target a particular geographic location, you can do that. And so I've been reading that with the fast changes in abortion laws, it's already being done for women who are seeking abortions, or for example, buying the morning after pill or the abortion pill. Apparently, in the last couple of years, 10 states where it's, your state included, it's illegal to have an abortion, have made demands for geofence data to Google. Now, Google has a lot of it. Apple apparently doesn't collect the geographic data in a way that they can then pass it on to law enforcement. So now Google has apparently said they're going to make an effort to make this more private, but I don't buy it. And I think that what we're going to see are more requests for Google to hand over data of women who go, and in Texas, for example, if you drive someone to have an abortion or otherwise participate, you can be subject to legal sanctions. So, for example, I would imagine in Texas, there were going to be thousands of requests for this data, and it won't just be women either leaving the state to go to a state where it is lawful to have an abortion, but it may be the people who drive her there or relatives or friends who go with. So I think this is an interesting trend to start just looking at and seeing how it plays out in real life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something to monitor, something to track. We'll have to see how that plays out. It looks like we've got some extra time here still. I didn't know if you wanted to possibly go into any more of these myths from the book, or if any of them are really things that you think would be great to cover still.
Well,
One that's always interested me is to some degree is number 10, which is biometric technologies are foolproof. And you had sent me an article about one that you wrote about that recently.
right. Yeah. So biometrics, and there is a shift, a trend because passwords are not secure. And that's largely because people may use their pets' names, their birthdays, the same old things, and they use them over multiple platforms. Haven't we all done that? So there are many tech providers and really sort of the gurus of national cybersecurity working together to come up with protocols to use biometrics in a way that in the future, I think it's going to take a few more years, will be safer for everyone to use, and especially for financial institutions and information that needs to be safeguarded. But the problem is right now, and again, there's not many states have solid protection if there is a biometric breach, and there have been breaches. So Illinois has what I think are considered to be the strongest laws in the country, so that if I live in Illinois and I gave my fingerprint to a bank and then their databases were hacked, and so a hacker has my fingerprint and can then recreate my identity, I can sue that company for losing my data, not safeguarding it. California has not quite, I don't think you can sue the company, but I think they're working on strengthening their laws. So obviously the problem is if your biometric data has been hacked, unless you have surgery or you alter your body, that's gone forever. And there have been cases where, I mentioned it in the book, where tech security experts have they've made face masks that have fooled sensors that read facial identification. They've gotten through airports and high security checkpoints with these prototypes that they've made. So I think the lesson with biometrics on a practical level, I know a lot of hospitals in New York give you the option of registering your handprint, your palm print, or your fingerprint. I always say no, because you have but one body part. Why risk having it improperly stored? And I think it's going to be perfected in the next few years, so that hopefully there may be a safe way to use some biometrics. And biometrics aren't just face prints. They're obviously also behavioral things, like with those test takers, certain body movements that are behavioral versus physiological.
Yeah, and you talk a little bit somewhat about their accuracy, and there's even been some documentaries, full feature-length documentaries that have been talked about, especially facial recognition, how inaccurate it is, and in some cases are like, trying to, I think it was in London, they were trying to use it to monitor and see if they would spot any criminals.
Also, it is known that facial identification programs right now do not do a totally accurate job of differentiating darker complected skins. I think especially African-American women has a high rate of error in those readings. Yeah, the problem is that when you're in public, our faces are being gathered by any number of cameras, and then in many cases stored. So the numbers of facial identification imprints are huge.
Yeah, I mean, it's to some, of course, we can try and fight against, having police using it, but, it's, if we're out in public, to some degree, it's not under our control if, it's, right. Some businesses who have security cameras.
Yeah.
Well, I think that has covered everything that we had originally planned on talking about. Do either of our participants or attendees have any questions that they about anything we've talked about?
They're choosing to be anonymous, which is fine.
Okay, here we go. Here's one. I guess well, one of them said no questions. I guess if we've covered everything we wanted to talk about. So I'm sure that we could cover the whole book if we wanted to, but but might just be good to wrap it up here. Yeah, one of our participants said, "Great presentation, thank you." So I did want to thank you for doing this program, Heidi. I was excited to talk about this and any you know, awareness that people can create so that, you know, more people are aware of these issues. That's, I mean, part of you know, making changes is first making people aware. So
Thank you, Patrick. One final thing I would say is, you know, you get a form, it asks for your social security number, you don't have to put it in. And I think making little stands like that and just saying nicely, I don't share that information. The more people do that, the easier it becomes. So, yeah. New habits.
Yep.
Thank you so much.